Hello, I'm Larry Shaw, and welcome to everyone interested in the story of 8 brave immigrants, the creators, so to speak, of the Shaw Kruse families, who sailed to America hoping for a piece of the American dream, to secure a piece of land to farm, raise a family, and call home. All 8 pioneers, often bringing with them spouses and children, left their home in East Friesland, Germany, realizing that they were saying a permanent goodbye to their parents, brothers, sisters, and friends for a new life in a strange country. They took a 10-day to 2-week freighter sailing journey across the Atlantic, and none of the 8 would ever return to East Friesland. If you are a second or third generation descendant of these 8 immigrants, you most likely can claim 100% East Frisian ancestors, because in most cases, the children of the original 8 also married East Frisian spouses, and this practice continued into the next generation. The German region of East Friesland, in the most northern part of Germany, is about the same size as Rhode Island, our smallest state, and with Omaha's population of about 500,000. The Romans first mentioned the Frisia tribes in the 4th century BC. East Frisia itself is a region in Germany that has a history going back to at least the 15th century, when they were independent, followed by being controlled by the Romans, Dutch, Prussia, the Kingdom of Hanover, France, and finally Germany. There is ample DNA evidence that Frisians traveled to the British Islands. Frisian ancestry often shows up in the DNA of British citizens. The original language was East Frisian, which morphed into Low German or Plattdeutsch. Most of the region today now primarily speaks High German, with some Plattdeutsch still understood by the older people. But our 8 pioneers obviously spoke what is called Low German or Plattdeutsch, a dialect of German which is very difficult to understand by Germans speaking only High German. When these immigrants left for America in the mid-19th century, the economy of East Friesland was virtually all agricultural, and its economy today is still primarily agricultural, with some shipbuilding, wind turbines, and olive plants dominating the urban areas. This is a typical rural Frisian home barn, the house in front connected to the barn in the rear. There is no evidence that these 8 individuals knew each other while living in East Frisia, except for 2, Shaw and Zabens, who married before they immigrated. After traveling thousands of miles from home, the rest met their Frisian spouses in either Iowa or Illinois. And if you happen to count all 8 as your ancestors, it is fascinating to discover that all 8 were born within a 50-mile radius from each other, with some couples having lived just a mile from each other. We can only guess why our ancestors immigrated, since there is no evidence of their motivation. They probably came because while most owned or rented some property, like a house in Frisia, they owned no farmland because most are listed as workers or sailors. But they were not destitute, since many bought land shortly after arriving in Illinois. Since all went into farming in America, it was probably their hunger for their own land which motivated them the most, and they had farming skills to make it a success. Now, one reason given by the Knock family for coming to America was to avoid military service. But ironically, 3 brothers of Harm Enoch fought in the Civil War, and a brother, Andreas, was killed in the Battle of Shiloh at the age of 20. To the left of this slide is a poster circulated in Germany advertising over 1 million acres available in the Midwest, with many railroads stretching west from Chicago, making it easy to travel to and obtain land in Illinois, Iowa, or Nebraska. Our pioneer ancestors took them up on such a good deal. Up until the last century or so, it was a tough area to live in because the North Sea would often flood the land due to the flatness of the terrain. It was and still is predominantly a rural region, and at the time of our ancestors, most of the land was owned by a few wealthy landowners. Thus, the vast majority of our ancestors were day laborers as farmhands. Consequently, when word spread that there was cheap and good land available in America for immigrants, thousands upon thousands of Frisians left their homes to finally become landowners and farmers. There was also constant warfare in Europe in the mid-1800s, which might have caused some of the young men to immigrate as well. But mostly it was a chance to become a landowner, which was almost impossible if they had stayed. So what was the voyage like for our ancestors? In 1889, the cost of a single steerage ticket was $33, but in today's money, that would be about $590. Some of our ancestors came with large families. Older sailing ships were cheaper. If they came by steamship, the trip would take about 2 weeks. Our ancestors must have had some money saved over the years because they had to pay for the steamship passage and other expenses for establishing a home in America. There is documentation that in 1868, Great-Grandpa Highshaw sailed free by first joining a ship's crew and then jumping ship once they arrived in America. A year later, his family joined him in Illinois. We'll say more about this later. So what was the voyage like? Conditions varied from ship to ship, but steerage was normally crowded, dark, and damp. Limited sanitation and stormy seas often combined to make it dirty and foul-smelling too. Rats, insects, and disease were common problems. By 1849, when our eight started to immigrate, steamships supplanted sailing ships and the voyage took about 15 days. By the 1860s, iron hulls were used and the speed was shortened to around 8 to 9 days. They probably traveled steerage class, which meant that they slept at and socialized in the same space with everyone else. Food was provided, but they had to cook it themselves, and they also had to provide their own bedding. So who is our earliest known ancestor? Well, there is documented evidence that a man by the name of Ert Nak, 11th great-grandfather, born in 1549, is our earliest known ancestor. His death date is unknown, but we do know he was born in some part of Friesland, and the Nak surname is a very common Frisian name. Our second earliest known ancestor is a man by the name of High Harms Shaw, spelled S-C-H-A-A, our fourth great-grandfather, born in 1707, died in 1792, born in Steenfelde. It is our first discovered Shaw ancestor. Shaw is a very unusual surname outside of Frisia. Now let's take a look at the history of our 8 brave immigrants. This story begins in 1829 with the birth of High Harm Shaw and ends with the death of Harm Eilert Knock in 1939. By this last date, all 4 couples had acquired farmland in Illinois and Iowa, built homes on the land, gave birth to 35 children, and in all measures of material wealth captured the American dream. This slide displays the 8 pioneers we are focused on, and below them are the 4 descendants who formed the 2 families which led to their descendants, Harold Shaw and Lillian Kruse, who formed the Shaw-Kruse family, which is the topic of this presentation. This slide depicts the 3 generations which led to the Harold Shaw family today. The first 2 immigrants were High Shaw and Herman Zabens, top left, who had a son named Harm B. Shaw. Gerhard Goljenboom and Rina Bagger, top right, had a daughter, Johanna, who married Harm Shaw and had a son, Harold, born in 1899, and who might be in the memory of many of you watching this presentation. This slide shows the descendants of the Kruse and Knock families, which led eventually to the Shaw-Kruse family. The Kruse family was formed by Conrad Kruse and Gretchen Hazerbrook, who had a son named Henry Kruse. He married Elizabeth Knock, who was the daughter of the 2 remaining immigrants, Harm Knock and Lemke Meyer. Henry and Elizabeth had 8 children, one of whom was Lillian Kruse, born in 1903, and who many of you fondly remember, and who married Harold Shaw to form the existing Shaw-Kruse family. Even though our focus is of the 8 original pioneer ancestors of the Shaw-Kruse families, we should briefly remind ourselves that it was Harold and Lillian Shaw who married in 1930 and created the Shaw-Kruse family of today. Harold's father was Harm Benjamin Shaw, seen in the photo on the top right, who sailed to America along with his mother and brothers when he was 8 years old. Unfortunately, he died young at the age of 42 when Harold was only 4 years old. If you were born before the early 1970s, you probably remember Harold and Lillian Shaw. At last count, these 8 pioneer ancestors of the Shaw-Kruse families have produced over 390 descendants, and counting. In the 1850 to 1880 time period, these 4 couples had an average of 8 children, while the last generation of the Shaw-Kruse family have less than 3 children. At least 6 descendants have lived beyond 100. A few other facts about the descendants of the 8 pioneers. None have engaged in full-time farming, with the 4 original farms long sold to the general public. Virtually all graduated from high school, with a majority of those in the last 2 generations having college degrees and several earning advanced degrees. Most entered the white-collar employment category as small business owners, office workers, teachers, etc. And due to the strong religious faith of the ancestors, at least 6 have become Protestant ministers. These descendants have mostly left the states of Iowa and Illinois and have spread literally from coast to coast, with still a significant number remaining in the Midwest. Now let us explore what we do know about our 8 ancestors, and let us begin with High and Hermina Shaw, whose maiden name was Zabens. They were the only couple who married in East Friesland before immigrating. We do know that he was the oldest of our 8, having been 41 and married, with 5 sons before he immigrated in 1869. And we do know that he was indeed a sailor at one time. In 1869, at the age of 41, he hired on as a sailor to be a crew member on the ship Berlin. And when they arrived in Baltimore, he deserted the ship. We assume he headed for Illinois to scout out the land with the idea of immigrating. All the facts match a description of High Shaw, which is in this German document, which lists the desertion of all sailors from 1859 to 1917. We can assume that he headed to the German Valley area to check things out. And 1 year later, on May 31st, 1869, his wife, Hermina, 34 years old, and their 4 boys, Harm, Harm B, Johann, and High, arrived in Baltimore on the ship Maine after a 2-week voyage from Bremen. And note that Hermina uses High's name on the manifest, but clearly it is she, because it states that High is 34 and a female. And we of course know that High was a male and was 40 years old at the time. From Baltimore, Hermina and her 4 boys probably took a train to German Valley, Illinois. Railroads were already penetrating the Midwest, and the Illinois Central Railroad was completed in 1856, the first land-grant railroad and also the longest railroad in the world at the time. More than likely, all of our ancestors came by railroad from New York to Chicago and onward to the German Valley area. This document shows that High became an American citizen on October 13, 1876, when he was 47 years old. There is some evidence that High and Hermina Shaw did own some land or house back in Germany, because house insurance records of 1856 from Germany show that High owned some property in Roudemore, which was insured. We have no evidence of their life in America until the 1880 federal census shows High and Hermina with a family of 8 children, with Harm B, or Harm Berend, 18, now listed as Berend. Hermina was also born in Frisia in 1835 and married High at the age of 23. Starting the family in 2 years, she gave birth to our grandfather, Harm Berend, in 1861. Harm Berend would change his given name to Berend by 1880, and finally by 1896 he shortened it just to Ben. After residing on a farm close to German Valley for 20 years, they moved to another Frisian farming colony 8 miles from Grundy Center, Iowa, where he bought a 160-acre farm. Their attraction to Iowa was the fact that there were other Shaw relatives residing around Grundy Center. In 1902, after another 12 years of farming, they retired with their 2 remaining adult children to Grundy Center, where they remained until their deaths in 1909 and 1911, Hermina being 74 and High 82 at the time of their death. 2 children preceded them in death, Berend and Johanna. They were married for almost 50 years. High and Hermina were very active in the German Presbyterian Church of Grundy Center, and he was also a faithful elder since 1901. Even today, if you would visit the church, a stained glass window can be found in the church which gives recognition to, quote, Mr. and Mrs. H. Shaw, unquote, for their gift of the new window for more than a century ago. Finally, a note on the spelling change for the surname Shaw. When High and family first immigrated to Illinois, they were listed as SCHAA on all the documents, the German spelling. By 1888, the federal Illinois census shows that High had changed the spelling to SHAW. And when H. Berend was married in 1896, our grandfather, he listed his surname as Shaw, S-H-A-W. When High moved the family to Iowa, the 1900 census shows he kept the Shaw spelling, S-H-A-W. But then on plat maps, he was listed sometimes as S-C-H-A-A. It appears he used both spellings in Iowa at various times. Thus, when High died in 1911 in Grundy Center, his surviving family chose SCHAA as his final surname, reverting back to the original spelling in German. Now to the Gullienboems, our second set of pioneers. It can be said that Gerhard Gullienboem, or Golden Tree in English, started our first preacher's kid string in the family. George, as he was called in America, was born in 1839 to Reverend Eno Gullienboem, a pastor of an evangelical Lutheran church in the small village of Uplevard for 36 years, and his second wife, Dicha. Unfortunately, at the age of 3, his mother, Dicha, died at the age of 31 after giving birth to her 4th child in 5 years. He was the oldest of Reverend Gullienboem's 7 children. After the death of his first wife, Reverend Gullienboem remarried 5 years later and added 4 more children to his family. The father of Gerhard, Reverend Gullienboem, needs special mention. At the age of 63 and after the death of a daughter at age 20, he decided to join his 3 children in America. He and his wife, Vubina, 50, and 2 remaining children left for America in 1869 to settle in German Valley. 4 years later, his second wife died, and he passed away at the age of 76 in German Valley. As mentioned earlier, Gerhard immigrated alone in 1858 at age 19, and at 21 he married a local girl, Rina Bagger, at age 19. She was a Frisian and had immigrated with her family at the age of 7. Rina would eventually give birth to 10 children over a span of 18 years, with 2 dying very young. Johanna, our grandmother, was the 4th oldest of the children. According to her obituary, Rina was very active in her church, and she spent her entire life in German Valley. Gerhard died at the age of 78 in 1917, after suffering several strokes, at which time Rina moved in with her daughter until her passage at age 89 in 1930. Now, one of the interesting documents with Gerhard's name is a list of Civil War draftees, but there's no evidence that Gerhard ever joined in this effort. We do have records of Gerhard at the age of 27 paying taxes in 1866 for his cattle, $40 today, or $648 today, and a $3 butcher tax, which would be $49 today. One interesting tidbit about the marriage of Gerhard and Rina: you can see the wedding certificate from 1860, which meant that they were both quite young, 21 and 19, and he had no family at the time in America. Also, even though they were born just 16 miles from each other in Frisia, we have no evidence that they ever met until German Valley. Also, the wedding certificate states both were residences of East Friesland, not German Valley. Did they plan to one day return to East Friesland? We will never know. As stated earlier, in 18 years, Rina would give birth to 10 children, with 2 dying young. As this picture shows, the 8 remaining children in about 1903 show our grandmother Johanna at the age of 30 to the far right, standing the far right, and from the 8, 4 lived past 80, 1 lived past 90, and 2 of the daughters lived past 100. Here we have a very interesting picture of their golden wedding anniversary in 1910. Gerhard and Rina, pictured in the middle, with their 43 children, spouses, and grandchildren, are celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary at their farm home in Illinois. Gerhard would die at 78, 7 years later, and Rina would die at 89, 29 years later. Now we divert our attention to the Kruse side of our family, where we focus on our great-grandparents, Konrad and Grietje Kruse. Konrad was born in 1841 in Roerkum and was one of 10 children. The story goes that for 10 years, as a young adult, Konrad was a cargo sailor who visited Russia and many other Baltic ports. However, in 1865, age 24, he and his younger brother Jan decided to immigrate together and finally arrived in German Valley, Illinois. This is an interesting map. It shows the small villages where Konrad and Grietje were born. Even though they lived only 1 mile from each other, we have no evidence that they knew each other until they met and married in America. As for Grietje, family history shows that her brother Friedrich, age 20, first immigrated to America in 1847. Around 1843, Grietje then immigrated with her entire family of 9 children, and by 1860, we do know that they were all living in the same community of Maryland, Illinois, with their widowed mother, Antje, age 50. Here is one fact not often known by the descendants of the 8 pioneers. This map shows the location of the farms for each of the original pioneer families. They all immigrated first to German Valley, Illinois, and then purchased and worked farms. As you can see, each farm was only about 10 to 15 miles from each other, circling German Valley. Eventually, 3 of the families would all move further west to Grundy County in Iowa because the land was cheaper and better, and there was already many Frisians living in the area. There were 2 exceptions to this move. The Goldenboom family and one Shaw, Harm Baron, our grandfather, decided to stay put in Illinois. Grietje had a lot of tragedy in her early life. Shortly after immigrating, her father Willem had suddenly passed away at the age of 54. Tragedy struck Grietje's family again when her sister Alberta died at the age of 26. This is where the story really gets interesting. Alberta, besides being the sister of Grietje, was earlier married to Zeke Reinks. 9 months after the death of her sister Alberta, Grieche, at the age of 18, married Zika, the widowed husband of her sister and her brother-in-law. Thus, Grieche married her brother-in-law, who now became her new husband. At 18, she also became the mother of her sister's 3 children. Within a year, she gave birth to a son, Sverre. But major tragedy struck again 2 years later when a smallpox epidemic hit the area and took the lives of Grieche's husband, Zika, and his 3 children. But within a year, she had married Conrad Kruse. Look closely at this family picture of the Conrad Kruse family. It consists of 10 children, 5 sons and 5 daughters, with Henry Kruse, our grandfather, in the upper right. For some reason, Henry would later inherit the family farm, even though he was the 3rd oldest son. But also notice 2 young men in the middle back with the names of Sverre and William. At this point, Grieche had moved to the Grundy County area because this was the location where they obtained their marriage license. And let's remember that Grieche had brought to her marriage 2 boys of her own, which Conrad accepted into their new family. We know that because all family pictures indicate that Conrad accepted the 2 boys and raised them as his own sons, and they became part of the Conrad Kruse family. A later picture will show both men at the 90th birthday party of their mother, Grieche. However, they did continue to keep their father's name of Reintz. As was said earlier, Conrad and Grieche were married in Grundy County in 1867. We can assume that they returned to Illinois, which was the home of Conrad. And we can see in this picture of an 1872 plat map that Conrad, at the age of 32, was already the owner and farming 160 acres around German Valley. We don't know exactly when they moved to Iowa, but an 1884 plat map in Colfax County, Iowa, shows that Conrad now owned 260 acreages, with a brother John owning 160 acres nearby. More than likely, John might have persuaded Conrad to move to Iowa. This map also shows that Harmnock, who we will meet next, also owned 2 sections of 160 acres in close proximity to the Kruse farm. Over the next 17 years, Conrad and Grieche were able to possess 480 farm acres on 3 different parcels. In 1900, at the age of 59, and she was 56, they decided to retire from the farm along with their remaining 2 children and move 5 miles into town at Grundy Center. 2 months earlier, Henry, our grandfather, had just married Elizabeth Knock. This picture shows Grieche on her birthday, her 90th birthday, along with her 10 children, with grandfather Henry Kruse second from left. All 10 children survived both parents. John died 59, the youngest. Henry died at 89, the oldest, 5 weeks just shy of 90. And the average age of death for all 10 was 80 years old. Conrad's will was rather complex and followed the custom at the time by willing his farmland to his 3 sons. Note that I said 3 sons. Even though he raised Grieche's 2 boys, Sverre and William Reintz, as his own, they were not included in the will. While the 3 boys inherited the farmland, within 1 year each was to pay the estate $22,400. The entire estate, minus the farmland, would then be divided between the 8 children, which amounted to about $8,400 for each child. Grieche was given the use, but not the deed, of the Grundy Center home to live in for the rest of her life. And each of the 8 children would pay $125 yearly to their mother to cover her living expenses. But again, nothing was in the will for the 2 Reintz boys. The story of Harm E. Knock really begins with his grandmother, Anna Brunsnock, who, recently widowed with 8 children at the age of 47, immigrated to America in 1857 with her 6 boys, following her daughter Gipkadina, who had immigrated 1 year earlier with her husband to the German Valley area. Harm, age 1, came with his parents, Eilert and Jurina, along with the rest of the Knox. 2 years after arriving, his mother unfortunately passed away at the age of 22. 10 years later, in 1867, and after his father had remarried and started another family, Harm, his parents, and 2 sisters traveled by covered wagon to Grundy County, Iowa, to continue farming. 3 Knock brothers who immigrated with their mother established farms first in Illinois, but like several of the Shaws, moved to better land in Iowa and bought farms the first year they had arrived. By 1884, each of the Knock brothers owned 160-acre farms next to each other, as you can see on this plat map of 1884. Note also, 2 Kruse families, H.U. Kruse and Conrad Kruse, were very close neighbors. Lamke Meyer, wife of Harm Knock, born in 1865 in Upplingen, immigrated with her 7 siblings and parents at the age of 11 and quickly settled in Grundy County. 3 siblings stayed around Grundy, while the other 3 headed west to Nebraska to farm. Harm and Lamke met in Iowa, and by 1880, at the age of 23 and 18, they had married. For 1 year, they rented a farm and started a family, with Elizabeth, our grandmother, being the first child. Elizabeth was 15 when her mother Lamke died in 1895 at the age of 33, leaving Harm a widower with 4 young children. This family picture shown is an undated photo of the Knock family, with Elizabeth standing behind her mother Lamke. 2 years later, after the death of his first wife Lamke, Harm married Jenny Vanderloss, age 30, who instantly became the stepmother of 4 children, ages 8 to 17. Jenny was born in Wisconsin, 1867, the daughter of a Presbyterian minister and the oldest of 9 children. Both her mother and father were born in Holland and first lived in Wisconsin, followed by several years in Illinois, and finally to Grundy Center. Harm died in 1939 at the age of 83, and Jenny passed away in 1947 at the age of 80. They were married for 42 years. Harm's will was fairly straightforward, but did contain one little mystery. He stated that Jenny would obtain all of the income from the property, but not the title to the property. Only upon Jenny's death would the 240 acres be divided equally between the 4 children. At this point, we have no idea who managed the property. But what is clear is that Harm was a very successful farmer who left his family with farmland he bought for about $5 an acre and worth over $2 million today. In conclusion, these 8 ancestors of the Shaw-Kruse families all came from East Friesland, a small distinct region in the very north of Germany from the late 1850s to the late 1860s. They were 8 of the 7.5 million Germans who immigrated to America in the 19th century. Some, like Gerhard Guldenboom at age 19, traveled alone. Conrad Kruse at 24 came with his younger brother Jan, while 7 others, like High Shaw at 39, brought his entire family of wife and several children, the youngest being just 3 years old. Beginning in the 1950s, for a variety of reasons, the 8 retired from farming, and eventually their farms were sold to strangers. Today, there are very few, if any, direct descendants who are working these same soils as their forefathers. These descendants, numbering in the hundreds, can be found living from New York to California and engaged in work unimagined 150 years ago. Few of the youngest descendants would even know that their ancestors came from East Friesland. But many of the values, customs, and beliefs of these original ancestors would have been handed down from generation to generation and for generations to come.